following presentation has been developed as a means of demonstrating how I have achieved and demonstrated my ability to adhere to the 10 QCT standards. Whilst these standards have now been replaced with the 7 Australian Professional Standards, I'm still going to relate my experiences during my placement to the QCT standards, as it's essentially what I've been working towards throughout my degree. The following presentation is a self-reflection containing examples of work and lessons that I've compiled over the last 4 years of my degree. Whilst I'll be discussing how I have worked towards all 10 of these standards, my primary focus will be on teaching and learning, which contains standards 1 to 5. Standard 1 of the QCT standards focuses on the design and implementation of engaging and flexible learning experiences for individuals and groups. Personally, this is one of my favourite standards, as I'm always looking towards developing lessons and learning activities that are unique and will engage my students with content that can otherwise be quite dull if taught using traditional methods. An example of a learning experience that I've developed that was engaging and flexible could be seen in a lesson that I taught during my second placement with a Year 8 Mathematics Extension class. Although the class was classified as Extension, there were still students within the class that were not as advanced as the majority of the students, which meant that whilst I had to set activities that were challenging, I also had to take into account that not all students would be able to complete the same level of work. Taking this into account, I developed a game based around the same principles used for the board game Guess Who. Instead of having the students ask me questions in order to guess my chosen character, I had them work towards gaining clues that would narrow down the search. In order to gain these clues, students were given envelopes numbered 1 to 7, with questions relating to volume and capacity that progressively became more difficult. By completing the question in envelope 1, students would be given a second envelope containing a clue as well as another question, and so on until they reached envelope 7 and had enough clues to guess my chosen character. For the purpose of assisting those students who struggled with more complex problems, I had the class work in pairs to complete the activity. Whilst observing the class, I could see that the vast majority of students were engaged in the game and were motivated to work towards answering each question in order to figure out which character I had chosen. Looking back on the lesson, I really believe that it has been one of the best lessons that I've taught so far. To see how excited the students were when they were completing the activity was quite rewarding, considering the effort put in to organise the lesson, and the fact that all students were able to participate due to the varying difficulty of each question was very rewarding. Standard 2 focuses on the design and implementation of experiences that develop language, literacy, and numeracy. Due to one of my teaching areas being mathematics, it's really not difficult to develop lessons and activities that improve student numeracy skills within this teaching area. However, it can sometimes be challenging to incorporate the use of literacy and language. I found that one of the easiest ways of doing so has been by creating a word wall within the classroom. More often than not, students aren't very familiar with some of the key terminology used throughout different units. So it's a great idea to have these words displayed somewhere within the classroom so that students can become more familiar with them and so that they can be referred to throughout lessons. Furthermore, literacy and language can be further developed by having students develop word problems of their own for each unit of work within math. During a Year 10 math class, I found that many of the students had difficulty completing questions when they were explained in 2 or more sentences. As a way of assisting them, I thought it would be beneficial to have them write their own mathematical problems, as it would not only build familiarity with mathematical terminology, but also show them that these types of problems aren't as difficult as previously conceived. I had students write their mathematical problems on blank pieces of paper and distributed them among the class so that each student would have to complete a word problem developed by their peers. I found that students were quite proud of their questions and were engaged throughout the process of writing and solving each other's problems. I believe that this activity also demonstrates competency with Standard 1, as it was flexible in regards to various learning needs and was somewhat engaging for students as well. Standard 3 looks at the development of intellectually challenging learning experiences. As I've predominantly taught math throughout my placements, I found it quite difficult to incorporate the use of experiences that are intellectually challenging. So for the purpose of demonstrating my understanding of this standard, I'm going to use an example of work that I've compiled during my second curriculum studies for social science. For this subject, we were required to create a unit plan for senior study of society that focused on what shapes an individual. Within this unit of work, I developed lessons that looked at theories and concepts that required students to think beyond their capacity and respond to questions that were quite open-ended. One of these questions relates to the controversial theory of nature versus nurture, and required students to read a case study that examined the effects that environmental and genetic factors have on determining whether or not someone will become a criminal. From this case study, students were asked whether they believe that the person within the case study became the way he was due to inheritance or environment, and from this, use evidence within the text to support their stance. From this, students would then join teams to debate their points of view in answering the question, to what degree is human behaviour governed by one's experience and/or makeup? I believe that this lesson is intellectually challenging as it causes students to question the text and their own beliefs. In addition to this, I would hope that the activity would assist students in becoming more accepting of the fact that their peers may have opposing views and opinions to themselves, and that they must learn to respect difference within the classroom, which links somewhat to Standard 4 and the valuing of diversity, whether that be cultural or intellectual. As just mentioned, Standard 4 of the QCT Standards focuses on diversity, in particular the design and implementation of learning experiences that value diversity. When reading the elaborations, there is an apparent emphasis on diversity being classified as either cultural or in terms of learning disability. Whilst I've taught at schools that are quite culturally diverse, I have not yet had classes that resemble them, nor have I had the opportunity to teach in classrooms with students that have various learning difficulty, as most of these students attend alternative or one-on-one lessons for math where they have access to extra assistance. However, one of the elaborations for the standard makes reference to teaching and catering to students with different learning needs. As this elaboration is quite broad, my understanding is that it could relate back to students who do not learn best using traditional teaching methods and benefit more from visual or hands-on learning. An example of a way in which I have used alternative methods could be seen in a lesson that I developed for a Year 12 pre-vocational math class. Prior to teaching these students, I observed that many of them had difficulty with rudimentary mathematics and were not very engaged within a standard classroom setting. Taking this into account, I developed an activity that used visual tools to assist these students in gaining a deeper understanding of basic concepts, and had them verbally explain to me their answers as a means of consolidating their learning. The activity used Skittles for understanding colour ratios and required students to visually represent various ratios by using these aids. By having them verbalize their answers instead of writing them down, it assisted students in developing key language and literacy skills, which links back to Standard 2, designing and implementing experiences that develop language, literacy, and numeracy. The final standard for teaching and learning is Standard 5, which looks at assessing and reporting constructively on student learning. Personally, I consider this standard to be one of the most important within teaching and learning, because when used correctly, will assist students with improving their results. An example of how I have reported constructively on student learning can be seen during my last placement with my Year 9 geography class. During the final weeks of my placement, the students were beginning to prepare for their next assessment piece, which was a short response exam using pure paragraphs. In order to assist students and to gain a greater understanding of their capabilities, I had them complete a practice exam that resembled questions similar to those that they would receive on their actual exam. When reading over the work that the students had submitted, it allowed me to identify the areas in which the majority of the class were experiencing difficulty, as well as give feedback to each student on how they were tracking. The next lesson, I spoke to the students as a class about the key areas that could use improvement, and had them work through a booklet that scaffolded the process of planning and drafting pure paragraphs. In the final 15 minutes of the lesson, I had them rewrite one of the paragraphs from the practice test, using the steps laid out in the booklet, as well as the feedback that they had received. When walking through the classroom and briefly reading over the students' new paragraphs, it was evident that this lesson was beneficial to their learning, and that they took the feedback on board, with the help of the booklet to structure their paragraphs. The second group of standards is comprised of standards 6 to 9 and focuses on relationships. I'm not going to look at these in as much depth as I did with the teaching and learning standards, but that obviously doesn't mean that they're not as important or valuable. Standard 6 looks at supporting personal development and participation within society. Whilst on prac, I've been very proactive in terms of setting goals for my students and having them set goals in which they will work towards achieving throughout the semester. In regards to participation within society, I believe that I've achieved this within a unit of work that I taught to a Year 12 geography class that focused on food production, consumption patterns, and food security. By making these students aware of the various issues that arise within the world as a result of ways in which food is consumed and produced by Western society, it will encourage the students to take responsibility for their actions and to play a role, whether big or small, in changing the way that food is produced and consumed. In terms of Standard 7 in creating and maintaining safe and supportive learning environments, I believe that this is something that is almost done without being conscious of it. By creating a classroom that encourages participation, collaborative work, and is welcoming of student contribution, I believe that this is creating an environment that is safe and supportive. This is something that I try to instill within my students from day one of my placements, and because it is something that is continuous and ongoing, it's difficult to give evidence of just one point in time that this has been achieved. In regards to Standard 8, I do not believe I've sufficiently demonstrated my ability to foster positive and productive relationships with parents in the community. Personally, I think that it is something that happens over time, and that 4 weeks during my placement are not enough time to build relationships with parents and guardians of my students. In saying this is definitely something that I would like to work towards in my upcoming pracs, particularly within my first few years of teaching. I think that it is really important to initiate contact with parents, and that the building of teacher-parent relationships can be very beneficial to student learning. Lastly, for relationships, there is Standard 9, which focuses on working collaboratively with professional teams and faculty members. During my most recent placement, I worked closely with the Year 9 geography teachers in developing upcoming assessment items for the unit, as well as discussing student development and learning. I found these ongoing discussions with the staff to be quite beneficial to my learning, and I really enjoyed being able to assist them in creating items of work, as it gave me insight into some of the fundamental skills that I'll need going into my beginning years of teaching. I also had the privilege of attending faculty meetings with personal development sessions that looked at issues ranging from school resources to behaviour management. One of these meetings was a 1-hour refresher course on using the responsible thinking process within the classroom, which was one of the chosen forms of behaviour management at the school. As the RTP process is something that I was not well versed in leading up to my prac, I found this meeting to be very informative, and it really assisted me in being able to establish consistency in regards to behaviour management in my classroom. The final standard of the QCT Standards is number 10, which focuses on committing to reflective practice and ongoing professional renewal. As I said before, I took part in many of the professional development sessions at my school, which ties in well with this standard and many of the elaborations. Additionally, during this placement, I began to keep a log of my lessons and to reflect upon the positive and negative aspects of these lessons. I found this process to be very beneficial, as it allowed me to pinpoint the particular areas that I believe I have been doing well, as well as those that need improvement. Furthermore, I've been very proactive in taking on board any constructive feedback given to me by my supervising teachers and observers, as well as recording and taking notes. So this has been a reflection of how I believe I have achieved the standards set out by the Queensland College of Teachers throughout my 4 years of study. Whilst I believe that I am instrumental in incorporating many of these standards into my teaching, I do believe that many still need work, which is something that I would like to work towards throughout my 4th placement and internship. Thank you for listening.